Welcome to Engineering Influence podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. And today we are covering something that we have covered in the past. Is something that's very important for our member firms. And we're focusing really on the EJCDC, the Engineering Joint Contract Documents Committee. And to discuss EJCDC, I'm very pleased to be joined by Kevin O'Byrne with HDR. Kevin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Kevin is very knowledgeable about EJCDC and especially all the contracts and what they're used for. Kevin, kind of give the audience a little bit of a background, your work at HDR and how you got involved with EJCDC.
Oh, sure thing. I have been in consulting engineering for about 35 or 36 years. Most of my project work has been of a wastewater nature, primarily design and construction. Most of my clients over the years were public owners, but a number of private owners as well. Here at HDR, I'm the manager of the firm's master specification system for engineer-led projects, and that includes our use of EJCDC documents in what we call Division 0. The various divisions being an organizational format set up by the Construction Specifications Institute, and the Division 0 documents and a set of construction documents will be comprised of bidding type requirements or procurement requirements, such as an advertisement or invitation to bid, instructions to bidders, bid form, various bond forms, owner-contractor agreement, general conditions, supplementary conditions, and maybe some other similar types of documents. Those are all what we mean when we talk about Division 0 documents. EJCDC as an organization primarily publishes relative to construction contracts division model documents for what I'm calling Division 0. EJCDC, of course, also publishes a parallel set of contract forms for professional services contracts, such as the agreement between an owner and its engineering consultant and between an engineer and its subconsultants. And EJCDC, of course, publishes documents for a variety of different what's called project delivery methods, whether design, bid, build, either with or without a third-party construction manager as advisor. EJCDC has separate construction documents for each one of those scenarios. Contract documents for construction manager at risk project delivery, sometimes abbreviated as CMAR, for design build, and even others, such as a project owner's direct procurement of complex equipment from an equipment seller without an associated installation component. And EJCDC even has some other additional documents beyond those, but those are most of the main document family.
And the nice thing about EJCDC documents is that they are fairly well tested. And these are documents, contract documents that aren't just, written and put into a library, but they're stress tested by attorneys, by use. So a firm that uses any of the divisions of EJCDC contract documents can be fairly assured that they can rely on the language there for really any of the needs that they want to use those documents for, right?
Pretty much, yes. Just in the interest of full disclosure, and EJCDC would never claim that its model language is perfectly suitable for all situations, which is why we always recommend that consulting engineers that are tasked by their clients with developing the Division 0 or front end, as it's sometimes called, documents of a set of construction documents, that these always be sent back to the owner when they're initially drafted with a recommendation that the owner carefully review them in concert with the owner's own legal counsel to make sure that they're consistent with laws and regulations, the owner's own procurement policies, and so on. So a consulting engineer, at least in my opinion, is often in a fairly good position to develop the entire set of construction documents because, of course, engineers being licensed have to seal and sign the Division 1 through 49 specifications, the drawings, and so on. The Division 0 documents, such as EJCDCs, are not themselves the practice of professional engineering or any other design profession. So others, such as an owner or their owner's staff or owner's attorney, construction manager, program manager, whomever can prepare Division Zero documents, but I tend to suggest that it's best when the engineer prepares them, because that way there's increased potential that those Division Zero documents will be properly coordinated with the associated specifications, since the engineer or other design professional is preparing all those other documents. So to make sure it needs to really be a team effort between the owner, their attorney, their risk managers that are setting forth requirements for insurance and perhaps bonding, and whomever it is that's drafting the front end or Division Zero documents, that the engineer, when drafting these things, needs to send those into the owner with their a written recommendation that the owner review them in detail with the owner's legal counsel. So it hopefully, in that kind of procedural approach, whatever it is that the model language of EJCDC does not address will then be noted and properly tailored for the needs of the project and the applicable laws and regulations. Since EJCDC documents are very commonly used for, among other things, public infrastructure projects, of course, there's different requirements on public contracting in many different states. The retainage laws, the lien laws, and so forth will vary so much from one state to the next. And so EJCDC documents will note where these laws may vary a lot, but obviously can't furnish model language for every conceivable situation. But really, they're quite adequate for most. And when one follows EJCDC's advice, as I mentioned it earlier, about getting the owner's review with its legal counsel, hopefully then everyone's going to be in the best shape possible to get that project completed appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's to your point. I mean, extremely important always to have that secondary review and third level review with clients, but definitely the EJCDC documents give the firms the starting point for contract language. Today we're going to look at EJCDC and really how it interacts with, a good real world situation of construction claims that arise from differing site conditions and delays. And there's a lot kind of going in here in detail because the varying levels of delay and issues related to site condition. To kick it off, Kevin, how common are construction claims that do arise from differing site conditions? I mean, how frequent are those, and why are those important?
Yeah, really, I think very common. And as I tend to advise project teams and those who might get referred to me because they directed a question to EJCDC, once in a while I get to answer a few of those questions. And I'll typically tell folks like that, at least in my experience, the two most common categories of claims are differing site conditions and contractor delay claims. And of course, differing site condition claims often include delay component. And other types of construction delays might include a delay caused by an owner and by other entities. And, but really what we're talking about here today is differing site condition claims. So extremely common.
Yeah.
And these can become very important because since often differing site condition claims include a delay component, the costs on these types of claims, change proposals and claims, really can and does tend to accrue very swiftly. So once the contractor says, hey, I found something nobody was expecting, here's my notice that I've encountered a differing site condition, all of a sudden that clock is ticking and all the construction equipment, machinery, personnel on site, they all have a meter running just as if one was in, say, a taxi. And so, differing site conditions, fairly common and can become very expensive very fast.
What are the common sources of those claims?
Well, they can arise from a variety of different origins. And really, EJCDC more or less establishes three categories. They are: one, subsurface and physical conditions, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Two, underground facilities. And three, hazardous materials, or what EJCDC calls a hazardous environmental condition. The first, subsurface and physical conditions, just as its name implies, differing subsurface conditions, extremely common on any kind of project where somebody's putting some piece of excavation equipment, starting to dig into the ground, and one may find, for example, well, we expected it to be some kind of clay that was fairly competent and might not require a whole lot of temporary supportive excavations, but when we started digging the excavation, all the soils we encountered were runny soils, silts, gravel seams that conveyed a lot of groundwater. Now there was all kinds of extra work needed to support the excavation with sheeting and shoring and bracing and so forth. So that's one type of common subsurface condition.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is the location of rock. Maybe rock was anticipated at a certain elevation and it's found higher or lower than that. Or maybe rock wasn't anticipated at all. And once we got down 6 feet below ground, boy, we found some pretty hard bedrock. And now what do we do when we had to excavate an extra 10 feet below that or whatever? Yeah. Another source of differing subsurface conditions is the extent of groundwater encountered. If the contractor is digging a foundation for constructing a new building or putting in a sewer line or something of that nature, often the specifications for the earthwork require that these excavations be made in dry conditions, which requires the contractor to furnish some type of temporary dewatering system, whether it's what's called a trash pump and in informal slang, put into a sump excavated in one corner of the excavation, or whether the contractor has a more sophisticated and complex system of temporary wells around the excavation with dewatering pumps in those wells intended to draw the local groundwater table down below the bottom of the excavation. And when the contractor encounters way more groundwater than I suppose they or anybody else anticipated, that's a reasonably common source of change proposals and claims that I've seen. Differing physical conditions. Our first category was subsurface and physical conditions. Differing physical conditions, perhaps a little more straightforward. Here we're generally above the ground. We might be doing renovation or rehabilitation in an existing building or structure, and we found something in there we didn't expect. For example, I thought that if I knocked down this wall to connect these two rooms, and I didn't know that there's a pipe chase in the way, or didn't know that there were electrical conduits buried in that wall, or, gee, the foundation is a few feet different in dimensions than the old record drawings show it. So that's what's meant by differing physical conditions. The second type, as I mentioned, underground facilities, which is a term defined and used in EJCDC documents to basically mean buried utilities of any sort. And so underground facilities are treated by EJCDC slightly differently. I won't really get into that right at this moment, but of course you can envision where EJCDC documents are used on a variety of different project types, but most notably, if one considers, say, linear utility work, putting in a water line or a sewer line or a natural gas line or an oil pipeline or what have you, and it runs for some distance, especially if it's in any kind of a built-up area with any kind of development, there's going to be other existing utilities either crossing it or running parallel to it, or that somehow have some potential to interfere with it. Where are those utilities? Virtually by definition, they're a little difficult to know precisely where they are because they're buried. And of course, there's different ways of locating them. If the buried utility is metallic, metal detectors can be used. Some plastic pipes have warning tape above them, but nevertheless, there's almost every time someone puts a backhoe in the ground and there's pipe utilities around, there often winds up being something discovered during construction that wasn't anticipated, or we thought that pipeline was over there, and in fact, it's 15 feet away over here, and so forth. That's the second type. And the third type, hazardous conditions. In hazardous environmental conditions, it's when some constituent of concern, whether lead-based paint, asbestos, PCBs, or something else, especially if we were talking about excavation work that had contaminated groundwater, carrying some kind of a constituent of concern, but also in any kind of building construction, especially where the buildings are older than, say, 30 years, there's some potential for, as I mentioned, asbestos, lead paint, and other types of hazardous materials. These things are encountered quite commonly on many projects. And so the discovery at the site of an unanticipated, unforeseen hazardous environmental condition is really another type of differing site condition claim.
Now, Kevin, for the design, bid, build, and construction manager risk project delivery methods, how do EJCDC documents address risks associated with different subsurface and physical conditions?
Really, I think EJCDC documents have, a fairly unique and I think very equitable and appropriate approach to this, probably handling it in ways which I might go so far as to say are perhaps more sophisticated than other types of widely used standard contract documents. And in many ways, these provisions are scattered throughout several of the different documents of Division 0, whether the EJCDC construction or C-series documents or EJCDC's Construction Manager at Risk CMAR series documents. And it starts out with a basic concept. EJCDC has a defined term called technical data. And technical data is information on which the bidder or the contractor is expressly entitled to rely about existing information available about the site. Mm-hmm. We'll get in a short bit to what's meant by technical data.
Yes.
But first off, the existing conditions, existing information about the site, existing prior to the start of this project, whether it's old record drawings of the existing facility, whether it's old soil boring logs and geotechnical evaluation reports for earlier projects, or geotechnical evaluations and borings prepared by the owner or engineer for this project, and so on. All these types of materials that will constitute technical data in which the contractor has a right to rely to some extent are, according to EJCDC documents, supposed to be listed in the construction documents. EJCDC provides model language for doing this in the supplementary conditions. Any other existing information about the site about which the contractor might need to be aware, might want to be aware, we tend to believe in full disclosure of the owner's existing information about the site to bidders and the contractor. But where that information does not represent technical data, where the contractor has a right to rely at least in some part on it, that information is listed in the instructions to bidders. Why? Because the instructions to bidders are themselves never part of the actual construction contract documents. Rather, they pertain only to the bidding or procurement phase of the project. So we put those lists of information about the site that don't constitute technical data in the instructions to bidders. The EJCDC bid form and owner-contractor agreement form each include parallel language about either the bidder's representations to the owner in making its bid or the contractor's representations to the owner at the time the contract is signed that address many different things, but relative to our discussion here, these bidder and contractor representations include language that say, I have read and am aware of all information made available by the owner about existing conditions at the site, or I take responsibility for not having done so.
Yeah.
Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the EJCDC general conditions have pretty comprehensive language, much more detailed than of many other types, or really of any other types of standard form construction documents that I've seen in the standard general conditions. And relative to these project delivery methods, we're talking about EJCDC C700 general conditions. That's for design, bid, build, where the engineer has the full suite of construction phase services. EJCDC CMA 700 standard general conditions. That's also design, bid, build, but where the owner has hired a third-party construction manager as advisor for construction phase services. and finally, CMAR 700 standard general conditions when the project is being implemented with a construction manager at risk. So the standard general conditions of each of these three sets of standard general conditions have separate provisions addressing subsurface and physical conditions, underground facilities, and hazardous environmental conditions at the site. So, just to recap, the contractor and the bidder are expressly made expressly known to them are what information does the owner have about the site, whether prepared for this project or perhaps other earlier projects at the same site, and told to what extent do they have a right to rely on some of that information, and also to what extent do they not have a right to rely on that information. And we at EJCDC would certainly encourage owners and their consulting engineers to make all information known about the site available to prospective bidders and to the contractor. Quite frankly, not all owners always keep a good or complete file of existing information about prior projects at an existing facility, such as, say, a municipal treatment plant or something of that nature. But it's a very wise idea to keep a good file of that information so it can be made readily available in the interest of full disclosure. But the contractor, the EJCDC documents allow the contractor to rely on what's called technical data, either for those existing reports and drawings and information about the site that are made available, either what constitutes technical data on which the contractor may rely is to be expressly indicated, or if it is not expressly indicated, then there is a default definition in the standard general conditions, which basically says that technical data is basically factual information about the site on which bidders or the contractor may rely. So if we think, for example, about soil borings for subsurface investigations, that where the drawings show the location of that borehole, that location is shown accurately, that where the soil boring logs are made available to the bidders or the contractor, preferably not bound within the project manual, that the soil boring log accurately represents what subsurface conditions were encountered, and if there's any analytical work that went with it, such as determining soil plasticity or blow counts and soil strength, that those laboratory results are factual and properly done and are correct. What the contractor does not have a right to rely on is interpretations of what happens in between the boreholes. For example, where they found rock, the rock might go up, it might go down. It's not always a linear progression between one borehole to the next of what happens under the ground surface. Another thing is groundwater. You can take as technical data, as factual, that when we did the borehole and we measured the groundwater surface in the hole on the day we took the measurement, that measurement is correct. But you can't rely on that, since we took that boring 8 months ago, that's what the groundwater level is today. Often groundwater levels fluctuate seasonally. They might be influenced by the water surface elevation of a nearby water body. And so there's a lot of different things that can and do vary between those boreholes. And also the contractor is not allowed to rely on opinions. So, for example, if a geotechnical engineer's evaluation report is made available as information about the site, then the contractor is not allowed to rely on interpretations or opinions expressed in those reports. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that geotechnical engineers often have a bunch of disclaimers in their recommendations and the reports that say this is only for the purpose of the person who hired me and paid me, not for anybody else. And in fact, the EJCDC documents regarding the contractor's right to rely on existing information about the site expressly states that no representation is made that any subsurface or other types of investigations performed by the owner or engineer for the project they're never represented as being appropriate for the contractor's means. And when you think of it, if we continue with the idea of talking about soil boring logs, although similar logic applies to other types of differing conditions.
Yep.
A soil boring log in the geotechnical engineer's evaluation is performed for the purposes, by the owner or the engineer, is performed for the purposes of design, or maybe for characterizing the site of, does the owner want to acquire this piece of real estate for the owner's purposes? They're usually not performed for constructability matters. And of course, what one contractor may do regarding construction means and methods is going to vary from another contractor. And so therefore, if I'm going to build a building with a footprint of, say, 10,000 square feet, and I figure that 2 or 3 soil borings in the space of that foundation were sufficient, a contractor or a bidder might say, well, for my means and methods of construction, I definitely want more than that. I want groundwater monitoring wells and so forth. So we don't make any representation in the EJCDC documents that the information furnished by the owner is appropriate for the contractor's construction means and methods or safety and protection program. So those are very important limitations, which really go quite a long ways. So as I like to say informally to project teams, you're basically allowing the bidders and the contractor to rely on these existing information about the site to more or less the same point that the owner or the engineer would reasonably rely on it themselves, but not more. Of course, once we get into construction, if the contractor finds what they believe to be a differing subsurface condition, whether it's because the conditions at the site were found to differ from what they might regard as technical, what they're entitled to regard as technical data, or if there were any physical conditions at the site, subsurface or physical conditions at the site shown on the contract documents. I've seen, for example, in some linear utility drawings, there's some engineers that like to put the location of where they think the rock surface was right on the profiles. Certainly when we're doing any work in buildings or structures, we're showing existing facilities. So if anything at the site is found to differ materially from the technical data or what's shown or indicated in the contract documents, that's a potential source for the contractor to say, hey, differing site condition, and to provide a notice to the owner. Also, if the site conditions are of a materially different nature from what is normally expected in that area. So, for example, maybe to make a somewhat extreme situation, if you're in an area where often bedrock is found between 10 and 15 feet below the ground surface, and it's hardly ever any different, and then on your particular construction project, not only was no bedrock found, so there's nothing for the foundation to rest on, but not only that, but we also found a big puddle of quicksand. Probably not very common, but again, I'm trying to make an illustrative case here. Something weird, very unusual. That's also, it doesn't matter whether you took the soil borers all around the location of the quicksand and you found rock, but if you find something weird, that's certainly a location, certainly a basis for the contractor to send in a written notice to the engineer that says, hey, I found what I think is a differing site condition at this location. Here's why I think it's a differing site condition. And then EJCDC general conditions say the engineer is supposed to go immediately to the site, or at least promptly is, I believe, the exact word, and to give it a critical review to see what's really there and to make a determination on just how does this apparent differing condition, if it really does differ, how does it affect the design of the project, if at all? In some cases, it might be that's a different kind of soil than we thought, but it doesn't change our design, keep working. Or it might be of a nature of, well, use my example there with the quicksand where there was no rock on which to bed the foundation. Hold up, we have to come up with a whole new foundation system design. We'll get back to you. Or, as I've found a lot in doing linear utility work, especially in urban environments, whoops, that 36-inch diameter storm sewer didn't show up on any of the existing drawings, and we were planning on putting a gravity sewer right through where the middle of that pipe is. And now, how is the design of our new pipe, how does that need to be revised? Because we can't just bash through the old storm sewer and just say it doesn't matter anymore. You have to somehow work around it. So a change in the design might be necessary. The
Mhm.
EJCDC documents say that the engineer does this evaluation, sends it to the owner, but because it's the owner's site, the owner ultimately sends a notice to the contractor saying, we're going to change the design, or go ahead and keep building the thing per the drawings and specs, or giving the contractor some instruction. If the engineer's initial evaluation says, well, everything seems to be generally okay, you can resume work, then the engineer can give an early resumption of work notice to the contractor and say,
Mhm.
get back to work, in an effort to try to minimize the extent of any delay claim that might be associated with this differing site condition. So kind of a long-winded response, but it is a complex matter. There's a lot
Yes.
of different things at play, and that's kind of, I hope, a reasonably complete overview of how EJCDC documents handle this complex matter.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's true. I mean, there are a lot of different variables here. I mean, you do your prior planning, you do your site surveying, you do everything, all your due diligence before starting up a project. But it doesn't mean that you account for everything accurately, or you do meet an unforeseen obstacle, and that you need to address those, and that does call into question
I,
paperwork, and that's
I,
the importance of having these documents.
I have a short personal story that I've
Yeah.
told to a lot of people over the years that I think highlights the need for these clauses. I was at probably too early of an age, I was the project manager for an engineering firm designing an expansion of a wastewater treatment facility,
Mhm.
and this site was known to have a lot of high rock levels, and it was a fairly constricted site. It was only 4 acres. And
Yeah.
in coming up with the layout of the site of the soil borings we wanted to take during design, and this was 30 years ago, so it was going to cost all of something like $6,000. Seems like a paltry amount today. And the client sort of took me initially to some task over this, pointing at the soil boring plan and saying, why do you want to take 17 borings around this site? We all know what's down there, and so forth. And they were trying to encourage me to reduce the extent of subsurface investigations because,
Mhm.
quote, we all know what we're going to find anyway, unquote. Part of the project was building a couple of new aeration tanks. It was maybe 100 feet by 100 feet was these 2 new additional tanks. So I thought somewhat prudently put one soil bore more or less at each corner of these tanks. This was one spot the client had pointed at and said, why do we need all these soil borings? And of course, they all more or less justified the client's expectations. We found rock at about the same level in all of them, and so forth. Well, when we got out under construction and the contractor digs the big hole for the aeration tanks, it was found that we literally had hit the corners of what was otherwise a gigantic 6-foot deep hole in the bedrock with almost vertical sides, and we
Yeah.
needed many hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra structural fill to
Mhm.
backfill that hole and give these tanks something to really rest on. So it's just when you think you've got enough, there is always the potential for a differing site condition. And
Yeah. And then, yeah.
there might be some owners or even engineers out there that want to try to shift a lot of that risk onto the contractor. Well, we don't want any
Mhm.
construction phase change orders. And the client in the 30-year-old story that I'm relating here certainly felt that way. Their initial reaction was, why should we have to pay for this? And I said, and the answer is because you're the one that picked the site.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
It's not the contractor's fault that there was a big hole in the bedrock on which we all
Mhm.
planned to bury to bed the new aeration tanks. And of course, in a humorous ending to that story, of course, the client then said, "How come you didn't take more soil borings in the middle of where those tanks are supposed to go?"
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll never take the well, we all know what's down there as the chapter and verse answer when you
Yeah.
really don't.
But in a very realistic sense, you can
Yeah.
never do enough subsurface investigation. So there always winds up being some point that how many soil borings or whatever do we think
Yeah.
is enough to properly characterize this? I mean, there
Yeah.
is the potential for some overkill, and there's the potential for underdoing it, and what's the right amount. And it's not always completely clear, but having an appreciation that having a good when it comes to soil borings in particular, having a good geotechnical engineer involved, whether they're part of your firm or whether they're a sub-consultant, is usually a good idea when we're talking about differing subsurface conditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And doing appropriate due diligence investigations of physical conditions, if nothing else, going out to the site during design with, as EJCDC has long liked to say, at least in our guidance materials, with your head up and your eyes open to take a critical look around during design of what's really there, with an idea of, does this really differ from what's on the old record drawings of this existing facility? These are ways to help reduce the potential for differing site condition claims, but there's probably no amount of diligence which is going to forestall them in all circumstances.
Well, let's take a look. I mean, that's a perfect example of, going on site and realizing that, that you have this massive underground hole, which was not expected. I mean, you always also run into situations where underground utilities aren't properly labeled or have been somehow left off record. So you have the conditions of unknown buried utilities, but then also hazardous materials. So,
Sure.
Explain a little bit about how EJCDC kind of deals with those two.
EJCDC treats each of these in a manner somewhat similar to, especially procedurally, but nevertheless still a little bit different in terms of risk allocations than the subsurface and physical conditions. And for the reason that they're really different animals. For buried utilities, or as EJCDC calls them, underground facilities, of course, in many cases, especially if you're doing what's called outside the fence work, a roadway, a railroad, linear utility work like a transmission main or an interceptor sewer, you're likely to encounter a number of underground facilities. If you're in an urban environment, you're likely to encounter quite a few of them, which might not all be properly documented. And this, in a certain way, is a risk over which almost neither party has much real control, although, as I said earlier, the owner has the risk of differing site conditions and all these types of categories of differing site conditions, because the owner is the one that selected the site in the first place. But when it comes to underground facilities, first off, another entity, the utility owner, probably owns these. If one was working in, say, a campus-like site such as, say, a wastewater treatment facility or a business campus or an educational campus, there are very likely going to be underground facilities that belong only to the owner. But in a lot of other projects where EJCDC documents are used, again, linear utility work, roadway work, etc., you're talking that a lot of these underground facilities are owned by different utility owners, all occupying the same right-of-way. And so how do you accurately find out where these are to accurately depict them on the drawings? And the answer is it can be a challenge. There's a lot of different ways. I won't go into all of them, whether it's, 811 call before you dig type call centers, or simply having your surveyor accurately locate where the waterline valve box covers are and the manhole covers are. These are obviously useful ways for properly locating certain parts of the underground facilities. And maybe even other approaches that can be used. But there's also administrative approaches, furnishing your project drawings to the local utility and saying, can you mark this up for me? Whether or not they mark them up accurately may or may not happen. But so there's a lot of different ways in which the information on subsurface utilities can be collected and depicted on the drawings. The contractor is supposed to have a certain right to rely on with reasonable accuracy on this, but the EJCDC requirements on underground facilities acknowledge that some stuff is probably going to be different. It requires the contractor to carefully excavate ahead of their excavations, especially if we're trenching, to locate these underground facilities without damaging them. But also, if we look at these things, often we as consulting engineers tend to look at these things from our own standpoint or our client's standpoint and say, well, there might be a tendency by some people to say, I want to shift the risk onto the contractor because I don't really know where these underground facilities are, and just make the contractor responsible for finding them all. Well, really, how reasonable is that? The owner or the engineer might have had 6 months or a year or even more during the design to try to figure out where these are to the best extent they can, and the bidder might have in design bid build only a few weeks during the bidding period. So trying to require that the bidder go out and perform extensive investigations of the site during bidding, such as digging test pits or anything, they might be allowed to do that, but EJCDC documents do not require that they do that, under the idea that if the owner and the engineer have superior knowledge of the site, they should do their best to, as much as they can, to accurately depict it. So to establish some type of standard for the bidder and the contractor in terms of what is shown of existing subsurface or buried utilities, the EJCDC general conditions in recent years expressly require that unless you've actually physically located them, say by surveying, that you're at least going to use the basic approaches set forth in ASCE Standard 38, which is the American Society of Civil Engineers published standard for locating buried utilities. And ASCE 38 was updated just in the last couple of years. It's a long-standing document, but its most recent revision is only, I think, a couple of years old. Mm-hmm. And so it's also worthwhile for owners and engineers to know when they're developing the engineer scope of services for a project where underground facilities might be a factor, is that the engineer should be budgeting and scoping indeed to depict buried utilities in accordance with ASCE 38.
Got it.
And then when it comes to hazardous environmental conditions, mm-hmm. of course, I'm going to say, it's just like the subsurface conditions. You need to do a certain extent of due diligence to have sufficient experience to recognize when there might be a potential hazardous environmental condition that might be found at the site. Try to do your best during design to perform appropriate investigations and to properly document them, but under the idea that they might not always all be found. EJCDC documents account for this. In fact, many other standard form documents in recent decades do account for hazardous materials, but the EJCDC documents handle hazardous materials in a certain sense, in a procedural sense, similar to how subsurface and physical conditions are handled, that there's technical data and the reports mm-hmm. or drawings of an existing hazardous environmental condition are supposed to be indicated in the contract documents and so forth. But if a hazardous environmental condition or something the contractor believes to be one is encountered similar to a differing site condition or subsurface condition, the contractor is to send in a written notice and the engineer is to go investigate it. But unlike for a differing subsurface condition, the owner can't compel the contractor to remedy the unanticipated hazardous environmental condition. This is under the idea that not all contractors are experienced, equipped, or cut out, or even insured to mm-hmm. handle hazardous materials.
Yes.
One might say, well, maybe they should just go hire a subcontractor that can handle it. And the answer is, maybe they can, but do you really want to force a contractor that has almost no experience in this kind of thing to suddenly be in that kind of work? It's not always the best approach. Now, in many cases where hazardous environmental conditions were encountered on one of my own projects, the contractor was open to the idea of hiring an appropriate remediation subcontractor and the work proceeded. But EJCDC recognizes that not all contractors are able to do that. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, if you have a very simple, small, unsophisticated contractor, the owner might very well not want to have, it's probably in the owner's interest to not force that contractor into doing work with which they're unfamiliar. So the EJCDC documents say that the contractor is to secure that prospective hazardous environmental condition, stop the work in the area of it, not go near it, and that the owner will let the contractor know once the investigations are done, and if there is a hazardous environmental condition, when the remedy has been implemented, the hazardous environmental condition no longer exists, and then the contractor can get back to work. Of course, all that does allow the prospect of, contractor delay claims, to be sure, mm-hmm. but again, the owner selected the site, not the contractor, which is why it's a good idea to look for hazardous environmental conditions during design and hopefully not have the contractor find them for you once you're under construction. I did have a project once at a site, an existing facility built in the 1950s. And during design, when I said to the client, well, we're going to need to do some investigations to look for the presence of lead-based paint and some other stuff. And they said, we don't have any of that here. And I said, well, it's an old enough facility. With all due respect, you probably do.
Yeah.
And they still were reluctant to engage in those investigations during design. Fortunately, we were able to get them to agree to putting an appropriate contingency allowance amount, which is another useful aspect of EJCDC documents I think other standard form documents do not normally have in them, is contingency allowances. We're able to include a stipulated contingency allowance in that contract and have the contractor do some of that testing at the beginning of the construction phase, where we did in fact find hazardous materials and were able to get the remediation accomplished appropriately and in accordance with OSHA and other laws and regulations, and without adversely affecting either the contract price or the contract time. So luckily that client was more reasonable the closer we got to completing the design.
Absolutely. Well, let's wrap everything up and with one question about risk allocation. How do EJCDC's design build documents allocate risks associated with all these different issues, the subsurface or physical conditions, underground facilities, hazardous environmental conditions at a site?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a good one to bring up. EJCDC's current design build documents were published in 2016. I think they're actually a pretty good set of documents, but EJCDC is nevertheless, as of the date of this podcast, which is in September of 2024, is nearing completion of an update of its design build documents. And in design build, things are a little bit different. Yes, the owner furnished the site, but they contract with one entity, the design builder or DB, to do both the design and the construction. So the design builder has really the principal responsibility for performing appropriate design phase investigations of the site to properly design the project. So the design builder needs to perform soil borings and geotechnical evaluations and do their due diligence in trying to locate properly underground facilities and looking for hazardous environmental conditions and so forth. But nevertheless, the same basic idea applies, that the owner furnished the site, not the design builder. In the forthcoming, probably early 2025, although the exact publication date, I want to caution people, is not quite yet known, of the upcoming update of the EJCDC D series or design build documents will include some improved and more clear language about a contract, or design builders, I should say, right to rely upon any existing information the owner has and makes available to the design builder. And again, if it's work at an existing site and there's an existing file of hazardous materials investigations and subsurface investigations and record drawings and so forth, that the owner will make the design builder aware of these at the time they enter into the contract and indicate what the design builder might have a right to rely upon. So that's forthcoming language that will be, I think, a further enhancement of the D series documents. But nevertheless, in the design build documents, the DB has a little bit more responsibility and therefore a little bit greater risk to properly identify and characterize the site conditions and include appropriate provisions for it in their design. So there's fewer opportunities really for the design builder to come back to the owner about differing site conditions, unless it's of the truly unexpected, truly unusual type of site condition.
Kevin, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to extending this conversation and having you back on.
If I may just add one final thing here, I guess I want to clarify and emphasize here that, EJCDC is the engineers joint contract documents committee, and there are some people out there, including some owners or their legal counsels, who say, I'm not so sure I want to use these EJCDC documents. Why? Well, because since it has the word engineers right in the title of it, it must be favorable to the engineer. And really, over the years, in talking with a lot of different owners about what forms of Division Zero documents they use, this has come up surprisingly often. And I really believe EJCDC documents are impartial and fair to both the owner and the contractor and reasonable to all the other project stakeholders. As just one example of what we've been talking about here about differing site conditions, they treat this matter I think, with the due care that it truly needs, as opposed to other alternative forms of standard contract documents leaving it more open, and some that are non-standard being much more favorable to the owner, such as the contractor shall make no claim against the owner no matter what the contractor finds at the site, which is a little hard to say is reasonable. And then there's other documents which might be more favorable to contractors, perhaps maybe to a certain extent. So I think the EJCDC documents treat this matter properly and thoroughly and fair to all concerned. So it's really nothing that any owner or their attorney needs to have any fear. The EJCDC documents are, of course, a joint venture of ACEC, NSPE, and ASCE, but there are representatives of many other organizations and people from many different backgrounds involved with updating EJCDC documents, including owners, contractors, and all the other stakeholders in the project delivery process. So we're producing what we hope are a good, clear, easy to understand, and fair set of documents that really is in the best interest of the project, rather than bringing all the risk down on the part of one party so that one party is at least trying to escape as much risk as it can. We're trying to equitably allocate the risks to whichever party is best able to control it. And that's a very important aspect when it comes to differing site conditions. So just wanted to put that last thing in.
No, absolutely. Very well put. That is a very good point to make, that this is years of trusted advisors for clients. They have decisions and recommendations based on the best project throughout the life cycle of that project, and that these documents line as equitable as possible.
This is such a complex issue. I'll amend myself and say one more final thing.
Well, no,
I think
you talk about it really is. Everybody has a part to play here.
Yeah, exactly. And
everybody
I think that
cover
the more the project, the more a construction contract unequitably allocates risk to one party, like, for example, say throwing all the risk on the contractor.
Yeah.
That owners might and engineers might think that they're reducing the potential for construction phase change orders. Maybe they even are, but they're not necessarily reducing the cost of the project, because contractors are very savvy about risk allocations, especially things like differing site conditions, and will build into their bid prices necessary contingencies to attempt to cover themselves. And of course, who's the contractor who was the low bidder on the project? They're the one that had the fewest contingencies and is therefore taking most risks. And therefore, when some differing site condition occurs and everybody starts arguing about how much is this worth and the resulting change order, and sometimes there might be a tendency to look at the contractor and say, well, we don't know what the contractor put in his bid. He might have already covered himself for this. And the answer is, if they're the lowest bidder, they probably had the fewest contingencies. So it's, the contractor needs to be treated fairly in these kinds of claims for the owner and the engineer to really build a good business climate, because you don't want contractors putting in lots of extra contingencies all the time because they say this particular owner or this particular engineer always treats me harshly when it comes to differing site conditions, so I have to cover myself by just bulking up the prices that I bid in the first place. And that can and does happen in certain situations. And if you have a good relationship with a construction contractor, try asking them about it sometime, and they'll probably be honest with you in some situations. Not trying to imply contractors are dishonest, but that's a little like giving out their own pricing and trade secrets. So I think you do need to have an exceptional relationship with a contractor. But I'm fortunate enough to have had good relations with a number of contractors over the years, and they've shared these thoughts with me. So this is real stuff. So simply saying no no right to rely on existing information furnished by the owner at all. And there's sometimes a thought by some engineers or owners that if we just don't give them a right to rely on any of the existing soil borings or record drawings, somehow we're covering ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, that's just throwing more risk on the contractor, and therefore it almost forces the contractor to increase their bid prices above what they would be otherwise. So it all comes back to how much is this project really going to cost in the end.
Kevin, thank you again. Look forward to again having a conversation with you on this and kind of go into some more specifics, but really do appreciate your time on a very important topic.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Again, this has been Engineering Influence Podcast from American Council of Engineering Companies, and we'll see you next time.